Synth TV.
Hey everybody, Synth TV, and today we are looking at the new Elka-X from Cherry Audio, a recreation of the legendary and elusive Elka Synthex synthesizer. This is part one of a two-part series. Before we begin, please consider supporting our efforts via Patreon or Ko-Fi. Links in the description below. The Synthex was released by the Italian company Elka in 1981, based on a design by Mario Maggi. It is a polyphonic analog synthesizer in the mode of the sequential prophet or Roland Jupiter, but it had a number of unique features. Its oscillators were digital-controlled DCOs, making them much more stable. Moreover, the oscillator supported bidirectional pulse width modulation and ring modulation. The Synthex also supported two simultaneous voice layers and a 4-track monophonic sequencer. It had a unique and lush sound that was prized, especially because the Synthex was relatively rare even in its time. Among the most famous uses of the Synthex was as the sound for Jean-Michel Jarre's laser harp. I had the opportunity to play one at the Vintage Synthesizer Museum in 2020. I loved it, but also knew having one was out of my reach. So I was excited when Cherry Audio announced their virtual version this past week.
Shut up and take my money!
The Elka-X recreates the look and feel of the original Synthex, along with its sound and features. There are the two oscillators, the multi-mode filter, envelopes, an arpeggiator, LFOs, keyboard controls, effects, and the sequencer. One thing we don't see is the original joystick. Its functionality has been replaced by LFO 2. Let's listen to a preset now. One can hear the breadth and lushness of the synthesizer in examples like this. We're now going to turn our attention to the individual features of this instrument, starting with the oscillators. As mentioned, the Elka-X has two oscillators that model the DCOs on the Synthex. Each has several waveforms, cross-modulation controls, a pulse width control for the duty cycle of the pulse waveform, and pitch controls for the octave, semitone, and fine-tuning. Oscillator 2 has the same controls, but fine-tuning is used for relative detune. It's generally good to keep the two oscillators slightly detuned when using them together. Okay, let's turn down Oscillator 2 and listen to each of the waveforms on Oscillator 1. Sawtooth, triangle, square, pulse with variable duty cycle. Now, one cool feature of the Elka-X is the ability to cross-modulate the pulse width via Oscillator 2. Let's try that out. Different pulse widths and oscillator frequencies create quite different sounds. We can also cross-modulate the pulse width of Oscillator 2 via Oscillator 1 at the same time. The Elka-X also supports ring modulation. This is true ring modulation, where common frequencies between the oscillators are removed. I think it works best with square waves, producing bell-like tones. Once again, we can cross-ring modulate both oscillators. We can even do both pulse width cross modulation and ring modulation at the same time. Let's be real, that's not a pretty sound. With this much modulation, it is best to keep the oscillators at harmonic intervals like octaves or fifths. That's still a complex but quite playable timbre. We can take out some of those high frequencies using the filter. We will stay in 24 dB low-pass mode and lower the cutoff. There, that's a bit more gentle. Now let's add some resonance and bring in the filter envelope to further sculpt the sound. Nice. If we take the initial cutoff frequency down, we can get a classic analog bass sound. Okay, let's step back, reinitialize the settings, and take a more methodical look at the filter section. The Elka-X recreates the multimodal filter of the Synthex that was based on the popular Curtis chip. However, the Synthex and the Elka-X open up a lot more modes than were found on many of the analog synthesizers of the time. First, here's the 24 dB low pass. Let's add a little resonance. Now the 12 dB low pass. Bandpass with a 6 dB slope. A somewhat sharper 12 dB bandpass. And finally, a resonant high pass. That's a difficult one to use by itself, but we'll show you a good high-pass application later. For now, let's go back to the low-pass and bring in the filter envelope. This is a classic ADSR envelope that can be used to sweep the filter frequency. If we lower the cutoff and crank up the resonance, we get that classic squelchy analog sound. Keyboard tracking moves the cutoff frequency based on the pitch being played. Turning down the tracking results in a somewhat duller sound. But it's good for basses, especially with a 12 dB low pass. Let's try the envelope with the bandpass settings. Note the ringing at the end of the note, which is characteristic of bandpass filters. Okay, let's look at LFO1. It's a standard LFO with frequency control in multiple waveforms. The Elka-X LFO has two depth controls. Depth A modulates the oscillator pitches and pulse widths, while B can modulate filter, amplitude, or the sequencer tempo. Let's turn off depth A for the moment and turn on the filter for depth B. Try different shapes. Let's turn off filter modulation and use depth A for oscillator pitch. We can also use it for pulse width. This is more of a classic pulse width modulation compared to the cross modulation function we showed earlier. It's a nice sound. Let's bring back in filter modulation. As mentioned earlier, the Elka-X replaces the joystick of the original Synthex with a second LFO that can perform pitch and filter modulation based on the mod wheel and pitch bend. We can set an initial amount, and acceleration determines how much faster LFO goes when turning up the mod wheel. Let's add in filter modulation. We can of course use both LFOs together. One cool trick is to put them both in tempo sync mode to make a filter rhythm. Set LFO2 to 8th note and LFO1 to 16th notes. Turn down the oscillator modulation. Now there is one more oscillator trick we can do with the Elka-X. We can turn on Oscillator 2 sync for classic analog hard sync between the two oscillators. Changing the pitch of Oscillator 2 will change the timbre of the sound. It works quite well with square waves, and with Oscillator 2 an octave higher than Oscillator 1. Now, one odd thing about the Elka-X and the original Synthex is that there is no ADR pitch envelope, which one would normally use for the classic sync sweep. But we can use the glide function to have the pitch ramp smoothly at the start of each note. Turn it on for Oscillator 2, and fine-tune the rate and amount of glide to get that Cars-style hard sync sweep. hard sync works well with a high-pass filter and filter envelope. Let's turn that on. In Part 2, we will show some of the other features of the Elka-X, including multi-timbral layers, the sequencer, and effects. So please do come back to check that out. For the remainder of this video, we will look at a few of the factory presets. We hope that you've enjoyed Part 1 of our look at the Elka-X. To find out more, please visit cherryaudio.com and check out the description below this video. Thanks for watching, and please subscribe to CatSynth TV.